So shall we start?
We'll wait for a couple of minutes so that attendees are here. After that, we can start. Rajesh, you can start.
So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 61st webinar in the series, Rethinking Cities. Before moving on to today's topic, I'll give you a brief background about the series. Following the nationwide lockdown imposed after the first wave of the pandemic in June 2020, we in INHAF saw an opportunity to organize a webinar series on the theme, Rethinking Cities. Our thinking behind this was, one, our cities as they are today and the way they are growing and developing do not look like they are meeting the challenge of an urban population of 820 million by 2050, while continuing as the engines of economic growth that they are supposed to be. Two, governmental efforts alone are not adequate to ensure healthy, livable, productive, inclusive, and sustainable cities. And three, wider society has the required skills, expertise, and know-how to contribute meaningfully in the search for new approaches and solutions. It is perhaps the first time ever that such an effort has been organized to take the urban transformation challenge to the people. This webinar series is seen as feeding into a citizens' urban initiative, City URI, by getting to know more individuals, organizations, and institutions through their engagement with the webinars for their skills, expertise, experience, and interest, thereby building a support constituency. Using a part of the webinar outputs as startup material for activity to meet the urban transformation challenge, and thereby presenting City URI as a public cause, getting a message across for a wider societal ownership of meeting the urban transformation challenge. In the last 16 months, we have completed 60 webinars over themes as varied as cities, urbanization and the pandemic, homelessness, informal settlements and housing, informal livelihoods in the city, urban poverty, governance and finance, urban ecology and sustainability, water, sanitation and hygiene, sustainable mobility, gender and cities, youth and cities, heritage conservation, and architecture and planning education. Some 300 urban experts, professionals, specialists, and community groups have shared their views and perspectives on these multiple urban themes and sub-themes. Our partners for the webinars, around 90 of them, both national and international, have ranged from bilateral and multilateral agencies to academic institutions, NGOs, networks, urban local bodies, government ministries, social enterprises, and finance and microfinance institutions. We have till now more than 1.5 lakh views live on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. So these webinars will continue to be an integral part of INHAF's work in the coming years, at least 2 a month, to continue our engagement with civil society and build a citizens' urban initiative, City URI. So over to you, Amit, for today's webinar.
Thanks, Rajesh, and thanks for inviting me and us indeed to talk about urban employment guarantees today. So the way we—
Amit, can you be a bit louder? It's very soft.
Oh, sure. Hang on, let me just turn up my volume a little bit. Yeah, I was saying thanks to Kirtiji, Rajesh, for the invitation to speak in this really wonderful and long-running series as we just saw. What we thought we would do today is I will speak for about maybe 40 minutes or so, laying out the idea of an urban employment guarantee, what is it and what it can do. And then Jayatiri and Nikhil will respond maybe partly to what I have said, but also make points of their own because they are also both long-term participants in rural employment guarantee and associated movements. And of course, Professor Jayati Ghosh also is a well-known economist who has looked at all of this from an academic perspective as well. So I would very much look forward to their comments after I'm done. So let me get started. This is, since this is the 61st, I'm guessing that a lot of what I will say has probably been said in one way or another. But I hope that what I can do is bring together several different urban issues in kind of view them through the lens of an urban employment program. And I hope it will become clear what I mean as I go along. So let me share my screen. I wanted to put a question mark to an idea whose time has come, but then Kirtiji persuaded me to drop the question mark. So now it is an idea whose time has come, and I hope we are right about that. Here's what I plan to do. Just a brief introduction to why one might want something like an urban employment guarantee, which for those who in the audience who are not at all familiar with the context is something like MG Narega, but with quite a few major differences tailored to the urban context. So MG Narega, for those of you who don't know much about the program, is a long-running rural employment guarantee program in India. It was launched by the UPA government, the first UPA government, and Nikhil Dey was actually one of the people who were involved from the earliest days in asking for an employment guarantee and then designing it and helping with the implementation and so forth. The idea of an employment guarantee and a national employment guarantee has been with us for a while, and we have a lot of learnings over the last 15 years from Narega. And the urban debate very much is informed by these learnings, both positively and negatively. So I'll start with why one might want such a program. I will talk about briefly a proposal that some of us in Azim Premji University had made in 2019 for a program, and this was obviously before COVID. So this was a more of a long run kind of consideration we had. I will talk about some new state level schemes, which many of them call themselves urban employment guarantee. One can debate whether there's actually a guarantee aspect there or not. We can get into that. But nevertheless, there are interesting experiments going on. And most of these are COVID responses, I should add. And then finally, I will end with some open questions that arise when one thinks of urban employment programs. Now, typically over the last year, I've done a lot of webinars, and we always start with some dismal kind of statistics and numbers and those kinds of things. So I thought I'd do something a little different. Also, given that this audience might be a little bit broader than my usual audience. So I thought I'll just start with some pictures that I've taken over the years just as an amateur photographer in Indian towns, which prompt us to think about what an urban employment program, what kinds of things it can do, right? So that will kind of be an entry into why one might want such a program. And these pictures are just by way of, getting us in an interesting way. I don't mean to make any serious points, because I know that many other urban experts have spoken before me about many of these issues. So here's just a photograph I took in Khuldabad in Maharashtra a couple of years ago. And it's a kind of thing that you could take in many parts of India. It's a very typical, heritage structure from, in this case, around the 17th century, which is in ruins today. And this is part of a larger complex of tombs in Khuldabad, which contain famous tombs, but also some of these which nobody knows about anymore. And towns in India are full of these kinds of structures. Here's another example of a very beautiful Adil Shahi period structure in Bijapur in Karnataka. Again, surrounded by a lot of course, urban sprawl, and not very well cared for, but with a lot of potential to be rejuvenated, right? And of course, Bijapur is already famous as a tourist destination, and these kinds of investments can help spur tourism, to a large extent. I've done a lot of work among informal clusters in India, particularly in Banaras, but also a few other places. Banaras is famous for its weaving. Here are a couple of weavers who are using the urban public space to dry the yarn that has been dyed before it's going to be woven into a sari. And when you go to Banaras or you go to other kinds of industrial cluster towns, you'll see that a lot of public space is multi-purpose and used in all of these kinds of interesting ways. Again, a public employment program can significantly upgrade infrastructure that is used by local businesses like these, improving their productivity, improving their services, and so forth. Here's again a very typical scene, in many places in India. This is Miraj in Maharashtra, a town which is very famous for musical instrument manufacture. This is a colonial period marketplace, and like many of these colonial era marketplaces, this one is better kept than most, but still in need of a lot of upkeep, and could potentially be revived to a very nice mixed use structure, which could attract people just to see it, but also to use it, in this case as a marketplace. And then finally, just to remind ourselves, again, taking a sort of a different perspective on this whole thing, that India by now has given out something around 500 or 600 geographical indications, which are intellectual property rights that are given to traditional commodities, artisanal commodities of various kinds. These are agricultural as well as craft goods. And all over India, you have hundreds and hundreds of these clusters, mostly in small towns, which are quite constrained by the lack of local infrastructure, constrained in terms of growth, constrained in terms of doing quality control, export readiness, all these kinds of things. So a big program that invests in small towns and upgrades their infrastructure can be a huge job creator in small towns. So having said all this, now let me get to sort of the more conventional and boring parts of the presentation. So here are some things that an urban employment program can do for you. So again, what are we talking about when we say an urban employment guarantee? We are talking about a public employment program where the government creates works in different kinds of areas. What are those areas? I will get into very shortly. The government undertakes these projects at the local level. It hires workers, pays them directly wages that are at parity for men and women and pegged to some statutory minimum wage or higher. And it gets a lot of assets created that are needed or services provided that are needed. So in the process, what can you do? You can tackle underemployment and low wages in the informal urban workforce, which are persistent problems. You can, there are strong constraints to participation of women in paid work outside the home. You can do something about that. I'll speak about how you can do that. Migration from large cities to large cities from small and medium towns, of course, is a big thing, and from villages. If one rejuvenates the smaller towns, then one significantly alleviates migration pressure on large cities. Poor quality of urban infrastructure and services, I don't need to introduce to this audience. It's a well-known problem in India. Ecological degradation of urban spaces, again, a very well-known problem. All of us live with it every day. And the shortage of human and financial capacities of urban local bodies, again, something that I'm sure has been discussed quite extensively in this series. So all of these are problems that could potentially be addressed by a good urban employment program by reducing underemployment and offering income support, right? Raising private sector wages, meaning that when you employ workers on public works in a large way, you also improve the wages and working conditions of workers who are not part of the program. This is one of the big learnings from NREGA. A lot of research has gone into what does NREGA do for those who don't work on NREGA. And there are many things that happen, of course, but one important thing is that wages rise even for those who are in the private sector, because the labor market is less slack, meaning there is less surplus workers in the labor market, which improves their bargaining position and improves wages. You can pull women into paid work outside the home by offering work close to the home, by offering childcare facilities, by offering equal wages to men things that are not available readily in the private market. You can boost demand in small towns because you're injecting a lot of money there, and you can create conditions for successful entrepreneurship in a distributed area, because you can now, local increased demand makes local businesses more viable. You can increase productivity of local firms, as I said earlier, by alleviating their infrastructural bottlenecks and thereby create jobs. You can, of course, improve quality of life due to better functioning of public goods and services, and you can rejuvenate public spaces, build heritage and ecology. So all of these are potential things that could be addressed by such a program. Now, on top of this, of course, there is the obvious COVID impetus, which all of us know very well about. I'm not going to really spend much time on this. The context is very familiar, I'm sure, to people. The highly impacted sectors in COVID have been very large urban employers: trade, transport, hospitality, tourism, manufacturing, construction. Millions of workers across urban India work in these sectors, and these were the really badly affected sectors. And of course, as all of us know, there is little to no social protection available for majority of workers. And the urban social safety net is weaker than the rural net. So for example, NREGA is available in rural areas, but not in urban. And we saw a very heart-rending and gut-wrenching scenes last year when we experienced the largest reverse migration in history that we have experienced, with a lot of human cost that was paid mainly because workers had no safety net to fall back on when they lost employment during the lockdown and subsequently. So a combination of precarious work and low earnings makes for a very vulnerable urban workforce when a shock like this happens. And we are still living today, several months after, a year and a half after the first wave and several months after the second wave, we still have persistent urban poverty increases, informality increases, indebtedness has increased, and food insecurity has increased. Survey after survey has shown that. And I will not be showing you most of the data there. If people are interested, I can go into it. I'll just show you one kind of broad overall picture for those who are interested in these kinds of numbers. If you look at, I'm showing you here CMIE data on the workforce participation rate in gray and the average monthly per capita household income in green. So you see the big effect of the first lockdown there, which is the gray area, the first gray area. Employment recovered after that and then dipped again in the second lockdown, which is the second area, not as much as the first one. But employment is really not the big issue right now. The big issue is that people may have work to do, but they are not earning as much in that work. So incomes, if you look at the green line, is persistently below the pre-pandemic levels and doesn't seem to be recovering much, right? So I mean, it's recovered after the first lockdown, but then it has stagnated. So we are still looking at very much a depressed situation as far as incomes go. Now, let me come to the policy responses at hand, which is to do with urban employment programs. There have been some responses to COVID at the state level. There was a national debate going on last year about whether perhaps the central government was thinking of launching a national level urban employment guarantee program, but that didn't end up happening. The states went ahead and did a few things. So here's a list of states that have tried various things. I'll get into the details a little bit later on what have they tried. But these are the schemes. In Odisha, Himachal, Jharkhand, Tamil Nadu has just announced one. And Kerala had an older scheme that already existed before the pandemic for about 10 years. It was greatly expanded in budget during the pandemic. But when I say greatly expanded, that still leaves a lot to be desired in terms of the size. None of the allocations of any of these schemes exceed about 100 crore annually, which is probably far less than what is needed to make it a genuine urban employment guarantee program. But nevertheless, these experiments do exist, and they've all come into existence in the last year or year and a half. Okay, so let me get into a little bit of the details of our 2019 proposal so that gives people a sense of what do we talk about when we talk about urban employment guarantee. There are many degrees of freedom here, many kinds of things you could do. This is all by way of just a suggestion. So what we had proposed was starting with smaller towns in India, so leaving out the large metros, and the state capitals and things like that, and focus on towns with less than 1 million people, which accounts for about 50% of the urban population as per the 2011 census. And we had proposed 100 days of guaranteed work, which is following the NREGA pattern. The wage rate that we had proposed was 500 a day. I'll give you the reason for why we had said that. That is, of course, quite a bit higher than the actually existing wages in the urban economy in most places. We had also thought that one arm of such a program could provide training and apprenticeship for a fixed stipend to youth who have some levels of education. So maybe 12th standard pass or with a degree or a diploma of some kind, who may not want to work on public works, but would appreciate some help in getting started in the job market with some experience in the real world. What kinds of things could they do? I will get into that shortly. So what kinds of works are we talking about when we talk about an urban employment guarantee? Of course, there are the standard public works. I should say that our 2019 paper has an exhaustive list at the end of it, so I'm not going to go into the details. I'll just rush through things. People are welcome to look at that list if they're interested. So standard public works, of course, which is our usual infrastructure that is needed in towns. Everything from roads and footpaths and bridges and canals, gardens, parks, and so forth. You can specifically do green jobs. Right? You can restore or create urban commons and green spaces. You can do urban agri or horticulture. Some of these things have been tried in Kerala under their urban employment scheme. Of course, water conservation, monsoon preparedness, flood control, all of these are very important aspects. You can do monitoring and surveying work. So this is the kind of work that could be made available to people with some levels of education in the urban labor market. So gathering, classifying information on environmental quality or public goods. These kinds of things can also be offered on a contiguous basis for a larger period of time, so people might be more interested in taking them up as an internship or an apprenticeship. You can even do some basic administrative assistance type of things, filling in gaps in existing urban services. Care work is a very big one. Professor Jyoti Ghosh has written a lot about this, and maybe she will say something about it later on. We can think of care work from both angles. One, that carrying out care work in an urban employment scheme, of course, creates a lot of job opportunities to deliver that care, but equally well, it alleviates constraints on women to do other work, because you're making available balwadis or anganwadis or creches in a much more larger scale than otherwise is available. So from both sides, from working women having the ability to leave the home and undertake paid employment in the private sector, but also creating employment for women directly through care work. So that's something to keep in mind when we talk about more widening the scope of the types of works that can be undertaken. A couple of things on wages that there are many ways again of doing this. What should be the wages? And I'll show you shortly what the states have themselves done when they propose these schemes. What we had said was that you can take one point of reference as the recently proposed national floor minimum wage, which is 430 rupees per day in urban areas. This is the Anup Sarpati committee report. That's one thing that one can do. Of course, one has to keep in mind that the vast majority of casual wage workers and even self-employed workers in the urban informal economy earn less than this per day, particularly in smaller towns. So if you did set the wages this high, they would be higher than many other options. And then one has to think about what are the implications of that. I'll get into that towards the end. So anyway, we had done this kind of a calculation. One can do many other things. You can even peg it to whatever are the statutory minimum wages for various kinds of skilled work. And I've given you some rates here, for example, for type C and type B towns. So they vary anywhere from 370 rupees to up to 600 rupees. Of course, this will vary a lot depending on the state, depending on the size of the town, etc. Okay. So putting together some of these numbers on how many towns, what are the wages, how how many people are likely to avail of this. I'm not going to go into the details of this. I'll just give you a flavor of the kind of calculations that can be done. These are all numbers that are open to revision. We estimated that you could have something around 60 million households that are the potential workforce. Okay, so we are still thinking about a household here, because similar to NREGA, the scheme was about 100 days of work per household. But as many of you may be aware, in NREGA also there's a debate on whether the entitlement should rather be an individual level entitlement rather than a household, and that's of course something that would improve the program, but it would also increase the cost of it. So if you assume household level entitlements, and you assume that maybe around half the workers would show up for such a program, just rule of thumb, meaning that others either are not interested because they have full-time occupations or they earn more, etc. Then with such a workforce and with, let's say, a small section of educated workers showing up for apprenticeships and other things, you come up with a program budget of something like 2.8 lakh crores, which is a large number. For those of you who follow these numbers, you would know that the NREGA budget is usually around 60 to 70,000 crores, and during the pandemic went up to 1,10,000 crores. That's the highest that it has been. So this is more than double that. So for a much smaller workforce, and largely that's coming because the wage rates are so high. So all kinds of considerations come in here. Can we afford it? Can it be made cheaper in different ways? And one can talk about all of that. Let me spend a few minutes talking about the state level schemes, give you a sense of what has been going on over the last year and a half on this respect. So here's a tweet that I found from the Rourkela Municipal Corporation about the Odisha scheme, which is called Mukta. And this is a tweet about rainwater harvesting projects that have been completed in Rourkela under this scheme, Mukhyamantri Karma Tatpar Abhiyan, or Mukta for short. This scheme uses women's self-help groups to identify workers and to administer works. That's something that is interesting about this. Similar to Kerala, which uses Kudumbashri, which is a self-help group program also. So the Odisha program was started in April 2020. It was started with the name Urban Wage Employment Initiative, and then later on converted into a scheme in September. The objective is to give the urban poor in the informal sector immediate wages. These are all, by the way, verbatim text from the program documents. So I've just copied and pasted from the program document to give us a flavor of what they're talking about. So to get them immediate wages by execution of labor intensive projects, 100 crore budget run by the Housing and Urban Development Department at the planning coordination monitoring level, and then implemented by the urban local bodies and self-help groups and slum dweller associations. There's no maximum limit stipulated to the number of days. Eligibility, this is something that is an interesting thing. Who qualifies for such a program? In NREGA, this issue doesn't come up because it's a village, so there is no issue of migrants there usually coming in. Here, of course, we have to talk about who will qualify. Will it be local residents? What kind of migrants might be included, excluded, and so forth. So the Odisha scheme says that workers have to be from the ULB in which the work is being undertaken. And here are some types of jobs that they have listed in their scheme document. Again, familiar things: stormwater, rainwater harvesting, playgrounds, increase in green cover beautification, involving local artisans for beautifying cities, and so forth. And then they offer some facilities, etc. The Himachal program, very similar, started in May. Again, the purpose is to enhance livelihood security in urban areas. It did not have a budget. I don't know if that has changed. Again, the Department of Urban Development and urban local bodies were the implementing agencies. 120 days per household was the entitlement. You have to be a local resident of the ULB and you get minimum wages. I should say this is all on paper, right? So we know very little about what is going on the ground, except for anecdotal evidence of the kind that I showed you. And one important research area right now is what's going on with these schemes. And we are working on some of these issues. The Kerala program, the Ayangali Urban Employment Guarantee Scheme, is much older. It's a 2011 scheme. Again, the purpose is very similar, to enhance livelihood security in urban areas. Budget very similar, 100 crores in the pandemic year. It was 30 crores before, so expanded significantly, but still quite small. It has local self-government bodies are very prominently involved here. And because Kerala has a strong local self-government structure, they've managed to do more in this regard. Eligibility, again, residents of ULB, and they have this wage rate, which is actually quite low, 271 for Kerala standards, and indeed national standards too. So the program is almost entirely women. Whatever fieldwork we have done shows that men really don't go for it, partly because the wages are so low. And here is one photograph from some urban greening work under the program. And again, similar kinds of things have been tried out here too. I won't go into the Jharkhand. Jharkhand, one thing I want to point out, if you look at eligibility, which is the last point, they have said their criteria are a little bit different. They've said workers living in urban areas since 2015, workers who have been living in sheltered homes since 3 years, workers should not have a NREGA job card. So this was their way of dealing with this migration issue, that if you have your name on a NREGA job card, you can't be on an urban job card. Obviously, that's not a very good thing from the point of view of an effective safety net. It would be much better to have one job card maybe that collects both entitlements. Okay, finally, just in the last few minutes, let me talk about some open questions that are, it's still very early days for urban employment programs. All of these experiments that I told you are barely, a year old or something like that. Kerala is the only one where we have a little bit more experience, but uniformly the budgets have been very low. So the guarantee aspect doesn't work through, because for it to be a guarantee, you have to either offer work to everyone who demands it, or if you can't do it, you have to give them an unemployment allowance. It's only when you can do both these things effectively does it really become a true guarantee. And that's not really happening in any of these state level schemes. State budgets are anyway severely constrained. So what kinds of questions come up? With respect to the supply of labor to the scheme, meaning who is going to work on this scheme, one big question that is keeps coming up is, what is the status of migrants? Migrants from within the state, migrants from outside the state, and so forth. And of course, this question becomes more and more important the larger the town that you're talking about. And for obvious political reasons, state governments are unlikely to undertake a scheme that benefits out-of-state workers. But as you can see, most of them have gone very conservative and said only ULB residents. That may not be such a good idea. What if you have a kind of a ULB that is relatively well-to-do, with very few workers who are willing to undertake such work, but a surrounding ULB not very far away has workers who would like to work on these projects. They won't be able to do that. Similarly, some of the most vulnerable urban informal workers are indeed migrant workers. So if you exclude them from this, then really you've not solved the problem of the urban safety net very much. So how do you do that while not letting the scheme become a way to just attract a lot of migrants into the local labor market, which might have other unintended effects? What do we know about the nature of urban underemployment? So in NREGA, we can be reasonably certain that there are certain parts of the year when there are very few options in the village for people to do anything. This is the lean season. If you don't have irrigated land, there is no agricultural work, then most likely you are not doing much. You can offer yourself to work under NREGA. In the urban labor market, there isn't such strong seasonality. There are seasons and there is seasonal employment, but underemployment doesn't come in big batches. Rather, it comes in, you might have work 3-4 days of the week, but you might really want it 5-6 days of the week. Or you might have work for 5-6 weeks at a stretch, but you don't have it for a couple of weeks, and then you have it again. So it's a more complicated underemployment scenario, and so the program has to take that into account. Which brings me to the labor demand side, which is, how are you creating these works, right? Are you going to be create enough? Are you going to be able to create enough opportunities that it becomes a true guarantee? Now, there's no shortage of works to be done, as I hope I have shown you through that list, but the tailoring of this demand to the type of supply is important. Meaning, if you undertake projects that require people to be on a project for, let's say, 2 months, but there are very few urban informal workers who would want to go and work only on a government program for 2 months, then you're not going to get people working here. So that's something to think about. So how can you build more flexibility into the participation? Inclusion criteria I've already talked about. You will get a lot of workers if you open it to everyone, but then will you be able to provide the work or not? Wages need to be competitive and timely. Much more than in rural areas, urban workers have choices. They have fallback options. So if wages are delayed, they're not paid on time, they will not show up to the program. Another issue that has come up repeatedly in our consultations with various people is how are we going to deal with machinery and contractors? In NREGA, officially, there are no contractors. Officially, you're not supposed to use machinery. It's an employment generation program. Of course, that other things go on in practice. All of us know that. But in the city or in the town, the context is more complicated. Could the contradiction between asset creation and employment generation that is sometimes observed in NREGA be exacerbated? Meaning, there's a temptation to show workers and then get the job done by machines and by contractors, and then just give people some money. But you're not actually employing them for doing any work. So how do you avoid such situations? Do you allow for contractors if ULBs don't have the capacity to conduct these works? As I said, Odisha has tried to do it through SHGs, so does Kerala. Mostly ULBs are not going to have the capacity to undertake so many of these works. So will they outsource it to contractors? If so, what happens to the program, wages, working conditions, all of those kinds of stipulations that we would like to have? So these are all questions that have to be settled. Right? So just to conclude in the last few minutes, to go back to the COVID context, of course, we are looking at a huge once-in-a-century crisis, and we have severe pain being inflicted on those who are least able to bear it. Now, the immediate task is, of course, to repair these balance sheets of households that have been severely affected. People are in debt and so forth, and you have to revive growth. All of that requires spending. This kind of a program is really something that can do a lot of stuff that needs to be done right now, which is you need to give income support to hurting households. You need to create local infrastructure for local businesses that have also been hurt very badly in the COVID crisis. MSMEs have suffered tremendously. You can really help revive them by such a program. And of course, long run issues like improving quality of public goods and the environment and improving capacity of ULBs is also something you can do with this. The condition is that it is well designed and adequately resourced. Before I conclude, I should say that one big thing that I haven't talked about, which is there in our 2019 proposal and also there in a lot of the state level scheme documents, is what kinds of mechanisms do we think of for grievance redressal and accountability and transparency. There are a lot of learnings here from NREGA as to what works and what doesn't work. I didn't speak about it because Nikhil is here and he's very, very deeply involved in these kinds of issues, and I'm sure he'll bring that up. But that can't be lost sight of when we think about program design. And just before I end, I'd like to say that a lot of this work has been done together with many people, most prominently People's Action for Employment Guarantee, the group to which Rakshita, some of you know her, Rajendra Narayanan, my colleague, Nikhil who's here, Jayati who's here, all of them belong to this group along with other people, and some of my colleagues at Azim Premji University. We've been working together on these ideas for the last few years. And I'll stop now. Thank you. Rajesh, Kirti, how would you like to proceed?
Would you like to take questions now, or shall we have both the discussions and then take all the questions?
I think let them go first, then we can take them all together.
Okay, fine.
So maybe Jay, you would like to go first and then Nikhil? I mean, I'm just...
Okay, sure. Okay, let's just to get on with it. I'll go first. because I know that Nikhil will have lots more important things to say about the practicalities of this as well. So I want to pick up actually on the last point that Amit made. I think Amit has done this really excellent, comprehensive look at the whole issue. I want to pick up on that last point about the impact this has on the rest of the economy. And I think this is something that we don't push enough, because a lot of the time we are a bit defensive about employment programs. It's seen as a kind of cost. It's seen as something, oh my God, this much budget is on the employment program. And it's seen entirely as a cost to the fiscal sort of, on the state exchequer, and as money going down this tube, rather than something which is contributing to the economy. And insofar as it contributes, it really only contributes to the extent that it can do something about supply. Now, absolutely that part, it's true that the employment schemes in rural and urban areas can do massively positive things for various aspects of the supply of goods and services. And Amit has already highlighted a lot of those, which are absolutely essential for not just a better life, but for the sustainability of cities. If you read the report, which I strongly recommend everyone does, you will see that there's a lot of stuff about making urban infrastructure, well, I suppose green is the sort of shorthand adjective, but much more compatible with the requirements of 20th century environmental challenges and the kinds of things that we know are facing our towns and cities, whether it is pollution of the air and the water or various other kinds of environmental problems. So there are lots of positive things that can be done. But in addition, and I think this is something we should keep emphasizing, because most people simply don't get it, including journalists who write about this, it has very, very strongly positive macro implications. Okay, when there's a lot of work done even by places like the International Monetary Fund and all on what are called fiscal multipliers. That is to say, when the government spends, what is the impact that spending has in terms of additional economic activity. And even the IMF has found that there's a very strong variation in the kinds of fiscal multiplier you get depending on what you spend on. Why? Because if you spend on, let's say, a bailout to large firms, then maybe that will help a little bit in the multiplier, because now that firm will not close down, or it will not lose as many workers as it would have otherwise. But that is the extent of the employment impact in terms of the direct impact. And then, of course, that has some kind of other positive effect on the suppliers and so on. But if you spend on things which directly impact on households' incomes, the kinds of things that Amit was mentioning, and of course, an employment scheme is one of the most obvious things that directly impacts the household income, because you're getting wage incomes, then you are automatically getting a much, much higher multiplier. So even the IMF, in its study of various different countries, found that expenditure like that on employment programs, or money transferred to poor households and so on, gives you much higher multipliers, sometimes multipliers as high as 4 or 5, compared to multipliers of just 1, 1.5, 1.6 when you do other kinds of things. So there is a very important sense in which spending on an employment program helps to revive the economy much more than, let's say, a tax break to corporations, which is as much a budgetary loss as direct spending is, or other kinds of subsidies given to rich people and to large companies and so on. So I think we have to keep remembering that the employment programs, in addition to all the benefits they can provide in terms of various public goods and services and so on, also provide this recovery of consumption demand much, much more effectively. And that in turn means that over time you get secondary employment generation, immediate jobs that are created through that program. It is the fact that the revival of consumption allows new jobs to come up, for more goods and services to be produced. And in fact, over time, even the formal sector benefits from this. It's not just, of course, the informal economy benefits hugely, all the micro and small enterprises that Amit mentions, and which are all dying at the moment, as we know. But it also benefits the formal sector. So I think that is absolutely critical whenever we are considering the impact of an employment program at all, that it has to be recognized that it has a much more positive impact in terms of the multiplier. And it's not just some crazy left-wing economist from JNU saying it, it is the IMF saying this, that it has a positive impact on employment, on consumption, and therefore on economic activity. And we know that today in India, what we really need is a revival, especially of all these small enterprises and the employment generation, which has collapsed, especially after the pandemic. The second point relates to the kinds of work. And here, Amit, again, I'm really drawing on a point that he alluded to already about care work. So you see, we have to stop thinking about work only in terms of this very physical, arduous, unskilled kind of things which are necessary. We have to stop thinking of it only in terms of infrastructure building. Of course, that's important. Or even infrastructure maintenance, which is hugely neglected in our cities. That's all very important. But work is anything that improves the quality of life. And therefore, care work is absolutely critical in this. And this is something that has largely been ignored in our rural employment guarantee, but it's something that could easily be added. And in particular, it could certainly be added in the urban. It's actually much easier to add different kinds of care work into the urban. Amit mentioned that it's, care of the young, care of the old, care of the differently abled, and so on. All of these things are very important. But we also have to remember that this is work that is actually quite skilled. There's a whole tendency to consider, especially in India, that looking after other people doesn't require any skills. It doesn't require any training. It doesn't require any knowledge. You just look after them. That's simply not true. Early childhood care and early childhood education is really quite a skilled activity that requires training. So if we can think of a program that trains in these activities, which we need more and more of, and provides these skills and then provides those services, that does many, many different things. In addition to, of course, improving quality of life and enabling more women to go out and work and all of that, it also actually improves the quality of our people. It improves the ability of children to learn and go through life better and all of these things. Similarly, geriatric care, we are.
Hello? I guess
think-
we have lost.
It requires training. There are people with different kinds of disabilities, diseases, whether it is Alzheimer's, and more obvious things, but also different kinds of faculties that they lose with time, which require specialized assistance. We never train people for this kind of thing. We never reward people for this kind of thing. We don't respect the people who provide this kind of service. Once again, this is something which can be hugely sort of assisted by activities performed in an employment guarantee. And finally, something we often ignore, it's not just providing a balwari for kids or anything like that. It's also just ensuring that they get to and from them safely, or that an old person can have groceries delivered to their home. In other words, the sheer provision of transport of goods and services and the ability to be mobile for people who cannot otherwise be mobile on their own. That's a very important service. And this I discovered from the Kerala volunteers. They have a health volunteer program, which is slightly separate from the employment guarantee. But the health volunteers complain that, they can go and do some stuff, but the issue of mobility of the people whom they are helping, or being able to provide them with certain things at certain times, that is something which is not looked into. Again, it's a kind of service that can be hugely assisted by an employment program in urban areas. So there are many, these are just some examples, but there are many, many others. And of course, all of this involves training. And so we have to broaden our notion of training. It's not just training somebody in doing accounts, training somebody in doing X or Y. It's training in a whole range of services which we in India don't even recognize need specific skills. In relation to flexibility, I want to highlight that I think it's therefore also important to think of the employment activities in urban areas in terms of different times. So it may well be that some people only need assistance during the weekends or after office hours or at certain other times. We have to be able to provide those through this employment guarantee, but without being very rigid. It has to be 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or whatever. We have to actually provide flexibility depending on the nature of the work that we are going to be providing through this program. I personally am a big believer in individual entitlement rather than household entitlement. I think the household entitlement has been a major failing. And I think we should have pushed harder when we did the rural lobby. We should have pushed much, much harder to have individual entitlement. Because yes, it's true that women have benefited disproportionately only because the wage rates have been low. The minute you set a higher wage rate, I can guarantee you that it's going to be taken over by men. Just as we have seen during the pandemic that women have got pushed out of any jobs that are reasonably paying. So it's very important to have individual entitlements. It's very important not to restrict it to households. I would say get 100 days and every adult rather than 150 days and every household, but that's something that can be, discussed and debated. The issue of whether to make it a law, it's a very thorny issue. We have to remember that the state governments that are doing this right now are all incredibly cash strapped. The central government has put a squeeze on state governments like never before. I mean, really, it's unbelievable the kind of fiscal stress that the state governments have been put through. They have been handled the entire expenditure associated with the pandemic with only the ability to borrow more. And that means nothing. It only means you can borrow more. You have to repay the damn thing. Excuse my language. And that really means that from next year, state governments are going to have to start repaying the loans that they took to tide over the pandemic. They are going to be in an even worse fiscal position. And therefore, we're saying 100 crores is not enough. Amit is absolutely right, it's underfunded. But it's really hard for state governments to find this money. So we have to make this a national demand. But we also have to say that, right now for a state government, I don't think it would be fair to demand a law. They simply cannot afford it. The best cannot be the enemy of the good at this point. To establish a program, to show that it works, to show that it has beneficial effects, to show that it generates a revival of that economy, will already have a very important positive impact, I believe, in creating a greater constituency for an employment guarantee. So it's a thin end of the wedge kind of position. I don't think we should be sort of absolutist and demand that the state governments enact laws. They are not in any position to fulfill them. And anyone who tells you that they can is, living in some fool's paradise. We have to recognize that they have very, very serious fiscal constraints, that whatever they do, they'll have to take it out from somewhere else. We have to encourage them to do that and help them to do that, and to do it in areas exactly as Amit has suggested, beginning with small towns where we can show immediately that it has a positive impact, it's doable, it's feasible, and it generates a revival of that particular economy. I've already talked for too long. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. Nikhil, would you like to come in?
Just starting, you can hear me? Yeah. So, yeah, it's a wonderful panel to be on, particularly because you have two extremely powerful, articulate advocates for what has been long needed. I think it's not just the pandemic has only that much more acute, and the situation that much more acute. And we saw people who existed in this very desperate frame for all this period of time. But to just go back first to the whole issue of the sort of defining nara or the defining slogan of what employment guarantee was for everyone in the country, it was har haath ko kaam do, kaam ka pura daam do. And at the time that the employment guarantee first came, if we go back again and look at what the National Common Minimum Program promised, I think that's something that we should see. Firstly, that this is not a new idea. It is an idea, not that time has come. It's an idea that time long ago had come. And I just want to read to you the National Common Minimum Program that made the promise first in 2004, which was the UPA promise, and which produced so much that the UPA government, I'm quoting, will immediately enact a National Employment Guarantee Act, not rural. This will provide a legal guarantee for at least 100 days of employment to begin with on asset creating public works programs every year at minimum wages. Each one of these I want to point out are so important because that has been diluted severely. For at least one able-bodied person in every rural, urban, poor, and lower middle class household. So the entire rural area and urban, poor, and lower middle class, which covers, nobody else is going to come. The urban, and in the interim, a massive food for work program will begin. So in 2004, when the whole debate took place, the reason the urban was separated from was for many of the ideas that Amit has talked about. How do you organize an urban employment guarantee? Because the framework is different. The nature of work is different. The nature of public works is different. The nature of public land is different. The entire structure of governance is very different, even though we talk about 73rd and 74th Amendment in the same breath, but there's a very, very different nature to it altogether. And at that time, 2 or 3 things that came to mind. Actually, I think, so I completely agree with much of what Amit says in terms of organizing this, but I think there are some gaps, and those were the things that we were looking at when we looked at urban employment guarantee, even at that time, which is why many of us said, yes, this needs to be approached with partly the approach that we are taking to rural employment guarantee, but it needs to be seen in somewhat different ways. Firstly, that there are a huge number of people in urban areas who have found work for themselves, but that work is neither formalized nor legalized nor given any space. In fact, it is criminalized in many cases through very, very petty laws. So the entire street vendors law was a battle that continued right through and continues even past that law having come into place, or the building and construction workers fund. Are all these situations of people who have come to urban areas, found work, but they are thrown far away for reasons of residence, for no lack of space to live in, for place and proximity, for space to either have their carts or have their little shops or anything else that they could have. So it's not a question of right to work in the same sense. It is a question of recognizing the work they do, the contribution they make to urban life, to what Jayati called work is anything that improves the quality of living. So it's improving not just their quality of living in the work and what they earn, but this huge number of people in urban areas who actually are fighting for their own quality of life, but improving the quality of life of everyone else. And that's why for urban work, we do need to recognize services. We do need to recognize caregiving, the numbers of people who are there supporting all of that already. And to understand that some of our interventions are not just of providing public work, but actually to be able to regulate that whole set of work properly, to be able to then give a much better quality of life there. I want to make 2-3 other points. Recently, there was just a news item in the Deccan Herald that I came across, which talked about a whole number of panchayats who had become municipalities and who were really agitating to become panchayats once again. I know in Rajasthan, no panchayat wants to become a municipality, and there are a large number of increasingly large panchayats that should become municipalities, but they don't want to become, and the overwhelming reason is they don't want to leave NREGA. They want to actually continue to get that benefit of MGNREGA, and large numbers of the people there. And in what we call urban and rural is this very large blur between what is an urbanizing rural area and a peri-urban, large peri-urban area all around it. So I think to be able to recognize, even in NREGA, the Maharashtra Employment Guarantee Act, which was the precursor, which for 25 years was the inspiration for all of us to fight for an Employment Guarantee Act, actually allowed work in what they called C and D class municipalities. So even though it was a Maharashtra Employment Guarantee Act for rural areas, it allowed it up to C and D class municipalities, because there are many panchayats or villages which are no different from the urban areas which are called municipalities. And on their peripheries and in the nature of public work, a lot of that same kind of work can be done to improve the entire standard of living. So I think one of the things that I'd like to say is that the benefits that we need to look at when NREJ came in, there were all those debates. And of course, everyone said that it is going to fail. And Jayati said, we are not just some crazy left-wing economists from JNU, but the crazy right-wing economists also had only NREGA to turn to and National Food Security Act to turn to when they had to save a population from actually going under. Those were those laws. And in those laws, I think what I would like to say is that it's not just what the law provided. It's not just that 1,10,000 crores. It is that, of course. It's not just the quantum of grain. It is that, of course. But it's also the framework of a rights-based legislation. And that's why the difference between a scheme and a law, and that's why NREGA had some minimal kinds of elements in it, which we have to be able to provide. Right from the beginning in NREGA, when those of us who were advocating its proper implementation, and even today what we were fighting for, we keep talking about the 10 entitlements, the guarantees, the guarantee of 100 days work, the guarantee of payment in 15 days, the guarantee of, which was there at the beginning, of payment at minimum wages. And if those the guarantee of transparency of records, the guarantee of social audit, the guarantee of planning your own work. So those 10 can be rattled off by anyone across the country. And what it allows people to do is to actually organize around those guarantees, because to implement any of these things is a nightmare in many ways. And yes, even in an urban area would be a very big nightmare. But it is something that allows for a much better framework of people coming together to get, particularly those who are marginalized, to get things implemented. So I just want to make 3-4 points separate from what Amit said. All his categories of work are so obvious in how they are needed, whether it's care work, which Jayati also talked about a lot, green jobs, public works. But I want to say that one of the things that has been pointed out in NREGA and not counted is many of what we pass off as development now in terms of global warming is actually causing a lot of destruction. So can we not start doing a cost benefit analysis of what is the kind of work we want and what is that kind of work's cost and what is its benefit, both of those things. So there is this Indian Institute of Science study that has come out to say how much of carbon sink and carbon credits in India's entire thing, how much would NREGA contribute to actually getting us carbon credits if you were to do that calculation properly. I think there are many kinds of urban works that if they were organized around this kind of idea of labor intensive work, and by labor, I don't mean just digging pits. I completely agree with Jayati that it is a lot, all work is skilled in any case, but it is a lot of needed skilled work, which a whole lot of people are already doing. It's just that if we would give an opportunity to formalize it. I also want to say that NREGA in minimum wages were nowhere near a reality until NREGA came along. More than the Minimum Wages Act's implementation machinery, it was NREGA functioning as a kind of an MSP for workers, as a kind of floor market mechanism. And in fact, many of us often said that if you were spending 40,000 crores on NREGA, you were actually getting higher wages for a whole lot of people who were being exploited just because you had managed to set a floor, which is what minimum wages were to do. Urban Employment Guarantee Act can do a similar thing. You may not have to provide 100 days employment. People, as Amit was saying, if you manage to say that certain kinds of work for a certain number of hours will draw this kind of wage, it will actually force the urban areas and those who can afford it to not over-exploit labor at the level that they do, and will allow people to earn much more in the rest of their work they do. That's something that I believe we can do. So some of the things that, along with this idea of having these two economists who have talked about many of the things that will happen in terms of money and market mechanisms, I think one thing I'd like to say is that it's not just fiscal multiplier, Jayati, but it's also a social and democratic multiplier to have rights-based legislation around work. And I'd say that if you can legalize and empower, if you can regulate and afford people to organize, you will start changing your society in a very positive way. If you can make space for unions of people who are coming for urban employment guarantee works, then they will be able to take on the contractors as well. Otherwise, they cannot. And they will be then able to do that in a much wider sense, and we'll see society itself transforming and changing. So, if we see social security in legislations along with the urban employment guarantee, because one of the biggest problems for our urban unorganized sector is that they have no way to organize to draw the social security benefits when they're ill, when they have an accident, those periods of time when they have various kinds of, when their children are unable to find access to schools, those various parts of a social security framework with that urban employment guarantee and with other laws that exist, the dovetailing of those laws will again improve its access and reduce the kind of pressure in terms of money that you would say that an urban employment guarantee would have to have. The last thing I'd like to talk about, and again, in terms of that same, not just a fiscal, but a democratic force multiplier that it can be. We've seen that in NREGA across the country, is that if you look at transparency, grievance redress, participation, and accountability mechanisms, because it was the first law that empowered people to actually, first law on, not RTI empowered people vis-a-vis the state and state mechanisms, but this was the first one that was a development entitlement, that it allowed you to demand something that was economic in terms of the rights-based framework. And with that came transparency of proactive disclosure, with that came social audit, which that came these many guarantee mechanisms, which made it clear that if your guarantee was not fulfilled, you'd get an unemployment allowance, or you'd get a wage compensation for delayed wages, or penalties would be imposed on people who were not doing things. It allowed participatory planning of the works themselves. So it was not someone else who was doing that, but it allowed a community to further decide what to be done in a particular area. And finally, it did not, the Rural Employment Guarantee Act did not actually make space for workers' unions properly, even though they are being formed in many places. But it should allow this, the urban one should allow it, so that unions can actually become a negotiating force, unions of unorganized sector workers, a negotiating force with urban bodies, as well as contractors, as well as other kinds of employers. And we can learn from that in many ways. You are all budgetary experts. NREGA brought in a framework of transparency and accountability by saying 0.5% of the NREGA budget will go towards transparency, accountability, and social audit. That's allowed an entire social audit mechanism right across. Can we not say 5% of every public works budget, meaning 5% of the PWD budget, 5% of the PHED budget, 5% of the urban metro budget, 5% of all these public work budgets, we take them out and we say that they will be set aside for putting into the pool for an urban employment guarantee, where labor-intensive work will be organized. Can we not make that kind of space also, so that it functions? We have to see that 13 lakh crores was earned by 100 billionaires in the year of COVID. They did very well. That could have run a rural employment guarantee for 10 years. Adani apparently last year made enough for, you're saying 2.5 lakh crores is a lot of money, but Adani apparently made 5 lakh crores, roughly 5 lakh crores extra. He could fund 2 years of that urban employment guarantee, he alone, he meaning money that he's taken from distribution has to be seen as a part of a budgetary exercise. And that will allow it in a more comprehensive. Yeah.
Thanks. So, yeah. So, Kirti, Rajesh, how would you like to proceed now?
Well, I think let us find out if there are any questions. And other thing is this, that, with two remarkably, I think, thoughtful responses, I'm sure you would like to kind of, respond to that or add to it. We still have lots of time. So issue is not a time. And I don't think we should worry about time. Such an important discussion that's taking place. And so please, I think, if there are questions, maybe it's the right time to kind of take them up.
Yeah.
And Rajesh, if he's found some, and after that, I think you come in and respond. And then, of course, if Jaiti ji and want to talk, they can come back again.
Sure.
Yeah,
So,
there
yeah, go ahead, Rajesh.
Yeah, there are a few questions, so let me come to them.
Yeah.
Amit, you have seen and answered a couple of them, but still, for the benefit
Yes,
of everyone, let me.
Yeah.
Yeah, for everyone's benefit, let me just ask these questions again. The first one was, what is the basis of asking for 500 rupees per day under the guarantee scheme when the central government has fixed a minimum wage for unskilled worker at 600 per day or 18,000 a month? There was a connected question which says we should have a decent wage instead of a minimum wage because the wage depends on the cost of living. Now, the person who asked the question says that this was actually a tripartite Indian Labour Conference formula, which was accepted in the late 50s. They calculate the market price following Dr. Aykroyd's formula. The Supreme Court added 25% to it, and that is the minimum wage for the unskilled worker. The Seventh Pay Commission accepted it as the lowest pay scale of rupees 18,000. And this 18,000 figure is from 2015. And he says he will share the paper. So he will share the paper with me and I'll share that with you later, Amit. So that was one question. The second was about the costs of 2.8 lakh crore. Does it include administration and implementation costs as well? You have answered that yes, it does, and it is there in your paper of 2019. Another question, given the crumbling infrastructure in large metropolitan cities and their unsustainable and skewed development, why should metropolitan cities be excluded from an employment guarantee program? And another question is about the lack of social protection for informal workers. What are your thoughts on the Unorganized Workers Social Security Act of 2008 that was proposed to create national and social security boards at central and state level to devise schemes and monitor social welfare schemes implementation, which ultimately faded away? And after a decade, it got subsumed under the Code on Social Security 2020 that proposes, again, the same boards. And the questioner says it is still not on the cards of the government, and we hardly saw any welfare mechanism in these codes accruing to the workers during the pandemic. So do we need another National Commission for Enterprises in the unorganized sector once more? And how do you think an introduction of an urban employment guarantee can map onto this code on social security? There's just one more question, so maybe I can finish that as well. Considering that a budget allocation automatically makes such a scheme supply-based, as we have seen in NREGA for years, and erodes the demand-based guarantee nature that it is supposed to have, is a budget allocation at all to be decided in advance? And what potential alternatives are there? Yeah, so these are the 5 questions.
Yeah, so all good questions. I'll just say a few things and then Nikhil and Jyoti can come in. So I misunderstood the first question. I guess the reference is to the 7th CPC. And I guess the implication is that the government should stick to 7th CPC for its urban employment guarantee, which I would be very happy, but it's a very long shot. I thought what was meant was, that this is the minimum wage in the private sector, which it's not. The private sector minimum wage are much lower. But yes, I mean, if you could offer 600 or equivalent of 18,000 a month, that would be fantastic. of course, you would have to look at what effects that would have on the urban labor market, where the prevailing private wage is going to be maybe half of that amount. So you will get vast oversubscription, and then you have to decide what to do with that. So where to set the wages? I mean, I can put different hats on this issue and go on for a long time. From a welfare and an activist hat, obviously it's 18,000 is a good benchmark. From an economist hat and sort of thinking about what will happen to the private sector and many of the private sector employers who are, not Adanis who compete to get these workers to work for them. For them to suddenly be faced with a very large increase in wage costs is also not a very good idea, because their margins are not going to be so high that they can afford to pay very much higher wages. So all of these things start coming in, and I sometimes feel a little bit like an unwelcome economist to think about these, because then you're saying basically pay workers less wages. But nevertheless, these issues will have to be thought through when one thinks about where to put the wages, and maybe Jayati, Nikhil have other things to say about it. So that's all I'll say. The question about the budget is a very good one. That's the only one I'll briefly respond to. Absolutely. When you set a budget, you basically make it a supply-driven kind of thing, and it's no longer a truly demand-driven program. So the way to do this is through participatory budgeting, and to have a proper process for proposing of works at the ULB level and build it up so that the budgets are being submitted at each level up based on what works are being undertaken. And we have actually hinted at something like that in our proposal. So the costing is really just so that people have something to hang on to with a number. But I agree that once you set a budget, you're basically saying when we run out of the budget, we won't be able to employ you. And that's not the spirit of a demand-driven program. But I'll stop here.
Can I just add a little bit to what Amit said? I think all of us are agreed that our preferred ideal is a National Urban Employment Guarantee Act, bearing in mind all of the kinds of things that we have to think about, accountability and so on. That's obviously what we want. But, right now, if some states are doing it, we cannot, I would say, demand that they make it an act, because they can't. I mean, they will not be able to do it in any budgetary way, really. And that response is, for me, similar to the response I would say about the wage. That, of course, we believe in a living wage, but the best cannot be the enemy of the good. And that's it. That is what it will become, unfortunately. So I think we have to just be a little pragmatic right now in terms of using this as a thin end of the wedge to push for a much better, more expansive and more decent program.
Yeah, I don't actually have a whole lot to add. I think the wage question is certainly we have to re-establish, in a sense, that minimum wages cannot be compromised with. And therefore, I don't think it's to set, I don't particularly think that one should set 500 rupees or any particular figure. I think that should be left to the state minimum wage. And that's a battle that workers in those particular states will fight. And imperfect as it is a much better standard to go with today. That's the only thing that I would say. And we've lost that battle partly in NREGA because they've shifted away from the minimum wage, which is what established NREGA. If that had not been there, NREGA would have been a far, it would not have got established the way it did. I do want to say there was one question about why do we leave out the mega metropolises? I think we should not leave them out, actually. I think that's I mean, part of what happened and part of the reason of my saying the National Common Minimum Program actually talked about a national law that covered both rural and urban areas. We should have worked on both laws together. And now if we are fighting for an Urban Employment Guarantee Act, then I don't think there are too many people in a very dire situation, even employment-wise. And I don't think an Urban Employment Guarantee Act is only a question of providing employment. It's also providing conditions of just work and allowing for organizing of people. I really think that's the very important part of it. And that's needed, very much needed in our mega metropolises which don't provide any really many of the benefits of urban areas that are provided to one set of the so-called citizens.
Yeah, I should add that, that exclusion was the 2019 proposal, and the reason was just that you have to start somewhere. So we thought that it could be a good piloting kind of an experience to start and then expand, rather than rolling out a big program where we're not sure of the labor market effects, particularly because metros are complicated in terms of migrants and so forth. So if you want to, first try out in small towns, that was our thinking. Obviously, there's no reason to exclude them from the vision of the program. Nikhil, or Jyoti, do you want to address the Social Security Code? Because I think that's an important question. It's a larger question about, the fate of the 2008 Act and the current code. Perhaps maybe say something about it.
Yeah, this is again one of these, I would call it a rather fraught area, because one of the criticisms, if you like, from the left of something like NREGA is that, and therefore also the Urban Act, is that it can create two tiers of workers: those who have jobs and then those who have these NREGA jobs. In other words, public employment itself becomes a kind of segmented thing. And so, if you get an urban employment guarantee job, that's for so many days of the year, and you don't get any of the other benefits that a worker does, nor does the employer, in this case the government, see you as someone who deserves any of those benefits of any kind of security. And that is the problem. And that is a problem with the Rural Act, it's a problem with the Urban Act. In other words, there is a fundamental tension between the notion of decent work and the way in which we are pushing these employment schemes, because of the fact that we are recognizing that these are filling massive gaps where the labor market does not provide any decent or adequate employment. And this is a way of, as Nikhil said, improving the bargaining power of the workers. I mean, I completely agree with your point, Nikhil, that that there are social and democratic multipliers along with the economic multipliers. I completely agree with that. But so what you're really seeing is that the employment guarantee or any employment program is a way of providing a floor wage, is a way of providing minimum conditions of employment. But it does not really provide what we would call good work. This is not our ideal of good jobs. And of course, the best situation would be one where it's no longer required because few workers don't need it, that workers are getting alternative employment with decent work. What does a government do in that situation? Does it enable a pool of workers who are continuously on this, who basically live off this 100 days or 150 days a year and then don't get adequate work for the rest of the year? And we do not provide them the minimum social security and other things that we provide to other workers? Do we even treat them the way we treat all the skilled workers who don't get anything either, who don't get social security, pension, except in some states now they're beginning to do that. So there is a tension, and we need to think this through, and we need to think how exactly we would frame it so that we don't create this segmented employment even within public employment. I mean, at the moment, public employment is hugely segmented. There are all the privileged IAS categories, and then there are all the way down to the scheme workers. And some who don't get paid at all, they get incentives depending on like a piece rate for whatever they do. So I think we do need to think this through in the broader sense of the public employment. And that's not something that I have even resolved in my own mind yet. I mean, I'm willing to put it out there for discussion. I know Amit and Nikhil will have more to say on this.
Yeah, so I think the social security codes, again, need to be seen in the larger context of all the 4 labor codes. And the 4 codes together have really made it something that has been tuned towards the neoliberal framework. They have reduced workers' bargaining powers. They have those who have made gains in particular areas, their gains are being threatened. The few who have organized, so it's changing the whole thing into a completely welfare-based model rather than social security as being your rights. And therefore, I think, and that will mean a lot of trouble for a lot of workers who are beginning to make some gains. I think all the social security on the unorganized sector has been pathetic. And there, except for a few examples, we really have had a very bad situation. There, the only thing, again, from Narega's examples, and I think Jyoti will perhaps agree. So certain kinds of things we just have to see as basic citizenship rights. Pension, the right to pension. It has to, no matter where you worked or didn't work, at a certain age, the right to a certain level of pension has to be there. The right to healthcare, the right to education, the right to, when you are sick, some kind of, again, basic level of healthcare. These are all things that I think I don't see as related to your workplace, but related to being a citizen of the country. And I think that that's something that we have to fight in a parallel way. And Narega actually gave us a little bit of that framework. So in just what Jyoti is talking about, and a lot of the criticism of that, is that Narega has allowed a kind of a combination of citizenship rights with labor rights. You are getting urban workers, you are getting the entire unorganized sector of women, yes, coming into work, which in many cases people would consider drudgery, but they are coming in for the first time into earning, into organizing, into being able to do things. And there, while they are doing that, they are only not asking for Narega wages, but they're asking for a whole bunch of things related to what are their basic social sector rights. So I think that's, I mean, the Social Security Code is not the solution, but it's not that there was some great Social Security before that in any case. So I think the solution has to be, along with the urban employment guarantee, something which dovetails Social Security in a powerful way, and that has to be with a general thing of citizenship. It's not that you're employed on urban employment guarantee. Whether or not you're employed, you have to, as a resident of an urban area, get a certain degree of Social Security. And that's a non-compromise.
By the way, we should note that this is something that a lot of other countries provide. I mean, in China, this has been provided for urban citizens for 30, 40 years. So it's not some, incredibly crazy demand. It's a very straight and obvious demand.
Can I use the opportunity to ask one question? Yeah, I've been looking at it through the lens of circular migration and the huge number of circular migrants in the economy in the country now. There is an agrarian crisis and there is a growing climate crisis and lack of social security. Even Narega in its master circulars does not make any mention of migration as something to be tackled or managed in any way. So you find that a large number of people, they leave their families behind and they're migrating to cities for short durations of time and then come back to their villages. So they are constantly on the move between village and city. They lack social security in the village. Narega does not do enough for them. When they come to the city, there is absolutely no social protection of any kind. They are the most exploited and live in inhuman conditions, live and work in inhuman conditions. Even when we talk of an urban employment guarantee, there is this fear that we should not do something which encourages migration. So, I mean, this is the kind of situation in which we work under. So where does social protection for circular migrants come in? How is it recognized by policy and law and programs? If there are any thoughts on that.
Can I make a preliminary, this is something that has been demanded now for at least 10 years. The UPA government began this thing saying that we want to actually introduce portability of rights. All citizens' rights today are residence-based, all of them, right? You have to show your proof of residence, then you would get the food ration, then you will get education for your child. Everything is residence-based. The whole idea of introducing the portability of those rights is something that has been supposedly, I'm putting in quotation marks, on the policy agenda now for more than a decade. Nikhil, you were part of those discussions as well, right? Way back in UPA years. The Modi government has repeatedly said it's going to do that. In fact, we have every now and then the Prime Minister announces that he's doing it. And I think there have been at least 4 announcements by the Prime Minister himself and by the Finance Minister that this is happening. It's even been in the budget. It's been declared in the budget that they're going to do it. There is zero progress on this as far as I can see. So it is a political choice not to do this. There are logistical issues, but those can be, I mean, if you can impose a GST on the whole country, you can certainly do this as well. So the logistical issues are not the problem. It is a political constraint.
Nikhil?
Amit, why don't you? I just have something very little to say. So
So I also don't have a lot. So I mean, I would rather, approach this question from the point of view of why do people have to do this at all? Why do you have to deal with this situation where people have to shuttle constantly between these different locations and so forth? And clearly, this is a failure of local economies to generate decent livelihoods. And we're talking about villages, and we're talking about urban spaces, the kinds of spaces that Nikhil was talking about, spaces that are just turning from towns and villages into towns, and all the way up to smaller towns. There is a crisis for all kinds of reasons, both for educated youth, which is a certain kind of migrant population that we see, and for workers with no education, which is where the circular migration mostly comes in. So for me, it's a question of working on rejuvenation from the bottom up, from villages and small towns, where you're massively reducing the push in the first place. I mean, without doing that, let me say, social security and so forth is not really going to, mean much. Social security, portability of benefits all have a space in the policy, frame, but working on improving local economies all the way down to the village, increasing village level non-farm employment options, investing in village infrastructure that contributes to local value addition and job creation and so forth. There is no substitute for any of this, right? And that is how you are going to, through this kind of public investment, is how village livelihoods become secure enough that people don't have to do this sort of very, very periodic kind of thing. Beyond that, of course, one should think about how to make social security more effective.
yeah, I think one of the things that one should remember is that this is part of a conversation. So because we have an urban employment guarantee, it will mean more people coming to cities. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that will happen. And in any case, what we should be doing is strengthening the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in ways like Jayati had said, individual entitlements, they're increasing the numbers of days, making sure that the budgets, that it's not supply driven, but it is actually demand pulled. And making sure that the act in its conception is actually implemented, because the act has been extremely beneficial. If it were not an act, we would have not seen the many things that NREG has already shown us. We should use that as an example to further strengthen even just its own framework. And we should then use, again, like Amit's whole presentation is, it's drawn very heavily, I think, on the experiences of NREG, and that's extremely important. And I think in that, it's not going to draw more people into urban centers. It's just going to be that level of those people who are sitting underemployed in urban areas and a kind of support that will make their own living better. And perhaps if we keep concentrating on making rural livelihoods better, urban or peri-urban areas actually also looking at their employment requirements parallelly. It doesn't mean that because we start looking at the urban employment guarantee, we stop looking at the other parts. So that's all. And I think that we have to do, and certainly I think this circular migration is not of value. Those who are migrating to an urban area and are settling down there should have a quality of life that we can build through these guys. Can the urban employment guarantee become a minimum support price for urban labor?
Amit,
Yeah.
Ankisha says that Professor Janakarajan would like to ask a few questions. So can we have him come online and ask a couple of questions
course.
he wants to? Yeah. Okay, Ankisha.
Janak sir, you can speak.
Yeah, is it not? Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thanks, Rajesh and Ankisha, for this opportunity. You know, I found it extremely interesting listening to all the three panelists, and you know, I just wanted to, in fact, Nikhil in his presentation have made these observations which I wanted to make. Sort of, you know, otherwise, you know, I just wanted to caution that we are talking about the people who are migrating from the rural area to urban area, primarily because of the distress. So these are not a prosperity induced migration. These are distress induced migration who are settling down in the urban area. And that is why we see in most of the big cities, the slum population constitute not less than 35-40%. It's a huge. So it's a huge population. And we are now talking about that kind of a population. And now also, I must tell you, we are also talking about the people whom I consider the shock absorbers of the economy. I consider these people are the shock absorbers of the economy because whether there is a drought or a flood or distress in the economy, or is a deflation or inflation, whatever kind of a shocks that you see in the economy, these are the people who are going to be first affected, and these are the people who are going to absorb that shock. So we are actually talking about that people, those people, and whose employment we are now talking about. So coming to the urban employment guarantee. Now, the biggest issue that is really now bothering me is, well, we are talking about the guarantee of the employment. It's very, very important, extremely important. It's really going to make a huge change in their lives and livelihoods. But we are not talking about the working conditions of these people. Working conditions in the work spot, particularly the health hazard. I know how many people have been killed in the construction, in the process of construction of the huge urban infrastructure projects such as metro. And then the issue is settled simply by giving them a lump sum. We are not really bothering about what is happening to their family, the children, wife, and the entire system. They get destabilized. But then a distribution of 5 lakhs, 10 lakhs, that's it. So and not only that, the working condition is abysmally poor. The working condition is commanded by the tyranny of the labor contractors. The tyranny of labor contractors in the urban areas extremely, extremely abusive, particularly for women. So the gender friendliness is just sort of, I mean, we just don't talk about it. And the kind of a sexual abuses that is taking place, not just in rural area and more so in the urban area, in the urban employment and the urban civil construction work, I've seen it's quite a lot. And we guarantee, let's suppose 100 days of job for urban area. But these 100 days, when you work, you get the wage. If you don't, you don't. So which means I got to work all 7 days in a month and all 30 days in a month and no holiday. If I take a holiday, if I am sick, if I cannot come, I don't get a wage. And in fact, it's just not the social security, it is a humanness. That kind of humanness is not addressed in any kind of employment guarantee scheme. After all, in a welfare society, we are in a welfare society. In this welfare society, one's livelihood, one's right to work, and one's right to health, and one's right to have a decent life and a quality of life should be guaranteed. And it's just not the guarantee of work and the guarantee of one's own lives and livelihoods and the quality of life. And in fact, Nikhil and most of you have really, all of you have really addressed the issue of insurance. And I must tell you, it is just not the insurance. It is the insurance for the family one should talk about, not insurance for the individual concern. the insurance for the family. So and these are some of the issues which really bothers me. And in fact, I'm not an expert in this field at all. I'm basically a person who specialize in water ecology, environment, climate change, and so on. I've done very little work in the employment sector. I would say no work at all. But these are some of the issues which really have been bothering me, particularly in the context of the employment guarantee. People do talk about the employment guarantee as if it is a gift given to the people. It should be done in a welfare state, but you should go beyond guaranteeing the employment. That's it. Thank you.
Can I come in, Amit ji?
Yeah, please go
Hello.
ahead.
Because if there is
Please go ahead. Yeah.
nothing new coming in, we may kind of think to wind up, and I think a few observations that I would like to make. Is it okay? Or is anyone wanting to make any other submission?
I think please go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think before I thank you, Amit Saab, and the other wonderful panelists, I just wanted to kind of make a few very quick observations, very quick. One is this, that there was a reason, and there's a good reason to remove question mark from your question. Has time come for the urban employment guarantee scheme? The reason I was saying was this, that of course, as Nikhil ji pointed out, the earlier government had talked about very seriously about it. The pandemic and lockdown showed very clearly that time has come for something like this, and we needed it. We've seen the advantages, on the returns, that Manrega, the Rural Employment Program, has given. And and of course, there are a large number of, good number of groups working on it for quite some time, in terms of on how to put it together, its design, its structuring, etc. And I think it's going on for quite some time. So I really thought that, hey, this is something. And then of course, one heard that the 4 state government had started something. Now, and I think, so when one sees this in the context of your estimate of 200,000 crore, and no state government talking about more than 100 crore, to say that something has happened probably is a misnomer, if you really look at the gap. You're talking about, if your estimate is 59 million, 60 million possible beneficiaries, on this 4 state and 100 crore each, you put it together, it will not even work out a very small percentage of your total. And therefore, I think what one is saying is this, that even though one wants to talk about, its time has come, it doesn't seem that its time has come somehow. Second little point I want to make was this, that something has been working on urban areas for a long time. And this exclusion of big cities, metropolitan cities, and concentrating on smaller cities looks very attractive operationally to make it workable. But if you're really kind of keeping metro cities, the big cities out, you've got to think something else as well, because those areas very badly need something to happen. There's a huge amount of poverty. And I think and everyone knows what it is. So I think that is needed to be looked into. Then I think, your figure of 13,000, I just wanted to comment on it, Amit Saab, from the very personal experience I have. We are running Childline program for last 15 years. In fact, I'm its director for last 15 years. And Childline program is the one which essentially intervenes in a child in distress. It's an incredibly interesting program. Any child in difficulty, if you receive information either from 1098, which is a number, or any other source, from that point onward, the child is the responsibility of Childline. If the information about child in distress comes at 12 o'clock at night, the staff runs and catches that child and brings to our place. And it's an incredible program. It's a central government sponsored program. And you won't believe me, for the first 10 or 12 years, the full salary of the staff was 4,000 rupees a month. And this is central government sponsored funded program. And now it is raised to 8,000, and second category of people is 6,000. And I think it's a more than a full-time job. We have in our program 13 employees, where 8 of them receive about 8,000, and other 4, I think, 6,000, and then 4,000. Now that is the status of almost a formal program, because you are responsible for everything, and therefore I think there's probably you could reconsider the 13,000 rupees if it takes number. I think it looks very, very difficult. Other point which didn't come up in the discussion, but I think is very valid in the context of urban, that the possibility of creating productive assets or productive services in an urban area is much more than the rural area. If you're doing Manrega, say for instance, and for years and years, there's a limit to how much you could do in terms of creating a productive asset. In urban area, there are infinite number of possibilities. And therefore, if you were to look at a link up the program costs into the productivity component, it's very likely that you would have a better picture and greater rationale for going into it. And I think that argument of productivity in the urban context is very important. Coming back to this particular, those are the kind of very quick few comments on the presentation. It's very remarkable. I wanted to kind of say this, that as Rajesh pointed out, this is 61st or 62nd webinar. We've been running this for last 15 months. And this time we have changed the format. The reason is this, that all our webinars up to now have had 4, 5, 6 panelists and an anchor. This is the first time we tried out where we had a long 40-minute presentation and just 2 respondents. Now, the reason we did this was this, that there is a design in our mind. And that is this, that Urban Employment Guarantee Program is being talked about for a long time. So many people are working in it. And the idea was this, that whether we could use this webinar series in order to create a platform where all the ideas that have been kind of shared and put together in the last 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, come together and see if it's possible to evolve a design which could be produced. And I think it's not a design, 2 options, 3 options, but something where we move concretely in that direction. And wanted very much to use this opportunity. And therefore, even though we have taken 1 year to kind of do 3 webinars, our first webinar was on learning from Manrega, that happened in October 2020. The second one, which was coordinated by Nunu Roy, happened in August 2021. And third is now taking place in October 2021. The reason I'm talking about it, Amit Saab and Nikhil ji and Ma'am Saab, that we hope to organize at least 3 or 4 more webinars on the subject in the next 2 or 3 months' time. Maybe an idea is this, that can we use this opportunity, can we use this dialogue to move an inch further in terms of actualizing this? And that, I think, is a manageable ambition, doable thing. Of course, there are ideologies involved, there are ways of looking at things involved, but if we really think that this is something which is needed, time has come to kind of, work together. And we thought, we could use this platform that has been created. And it has some credibility, because if you talked about this subject for last 15 months and I put together 60 webinars, maybe I think, 3 or 4 more webinar, we could use this in order to kind of, go somewhere near, not really consensus, but some idea in terms of how do we move, so we can start talking to authorities, we can start talking to government, saying, look, this is design, this is the possible cost, these are the kind of possible ways of going about it. So I'm essentially sharing with you an ambition that we have, a design that we have. We take this further in the next few months' time, and I think we need your help, Jyoti ji and Nikhil Saab and Amit ji. Saying that, let me kind of, thank you profusely for this remarkably rich and thoughtful webinar. We learned a lot. I think our resolve that something needs to be done, I think, much stronger now. And Amit ji, I think, thank you very much, for making this long presentation. Thank you very much for putting the panel together and running it very beautifully. Jyoti ji, thank you very much for your brilliant comments, on saying it for the larger macro perspective is very useful. And Nikhil bhai, for a long time, I'm trying to chase you and get you, I think, on any number of platforms. So finally, I think we caught you, and I think, here there are 2 more webinars I want to get you on. We'll talk about it some other time. So thank you very much. I must thank my colleague Rajesh for introducing the webinar, and also I think, managing questions and answers. And of course, I'm grateful to Ankisha, a colleague who has been managing this for last several months and does a remarkably good job behind the scene, so that everything is in order, and it looks what otherwise behind the scene is chaotic, looks so orderly on the day of the performance. So thank you very much. And I'll Amit ji, I'll get back to you. Nikhil Saab, I'll get back to you. And Jyoti ji, I'll get back to you. I think, to take this idea further, because we just don't want to talk about this. We also want to find a way where something concrete happens. People in the cities are looking forward to it. And we have seen remarkable benefits, in Manrega, not only during the pandemic, but otherwise. And so there's so much good thought. We got to kind of find a way to kind of move forward. So thank you very much for being, and thank you very much for helping with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you.